Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Choosing Well, the Good, the Bad, and the Trivial by Chrisoula Andreou. Narrated by Lisa S. Ware. Publisher's note: this audiobook contains references to visuals present in the print and ebook editions of the book. Preface. Self-defeating behavior and the frustration it can cause constitute a deep and rich area of philosophical inquiry. This book synthesizes and incorporates, in part or with some modifications, a variety of my contributions published over many years on the demands of effective decision-making in the face of challenging choice situations that generate disorderly preferences and threaten to prompt self-defeating patterns of choice. The result is a unified, extended study of the role of rationality in accommodating certain well-grounded but disorderly preference structures while protecting us from associated self-defeating patterns of choice. The book's introduction, first chapter, and conclusion include selections, sometimes paraphrased or modified as needed to fit my current purposes, from Environmental Damage and the Puzzle of the Self-Torturer, Empowering Rationality, There are Preferences, and Then There Are Preferences, Rationality, Regret, and Choice Over Time, Dynamic Choice, Sweating the Small Stuff, and from several of the papers mentioned in connection with later chapters in the book. Chapter 2 is a modified version of Self-Defeating Self-Governance. As in other chapters, the modifications allowed the chapter to figure as part of a larger integrated whole and to be refined in light of relatively recent feedback. Chapter 3 combines modified versions of The Real Puzzle of the Self-Torturer and Cashing Out the Money Pump Argument. Chapter 4 combines a modified version of Parity, Comparability, and Choice, with modified selections from Parity without Imprecise Equality. Chapter 5 is a modified version of Incomparability and the Huge Improvement Arguments. Chapter 6 combines a modified version of Better Than with modified selections from In a Different League. Chapter 7 is a modified version of Temptation, Resolutions, and Regret. And Chapter 8 is a modified version of Regret, Suboptimality, and Vagueness. The book's title is drawn from titles I've used for other pieces, including the title of my Psychology Today blog, Choosing Well, the Good, the Bad, and the Negligible, and the titles of my articles, Choosing Well, Value Pluralism and Patterns of Choice, and The Good, the Bad, and the Trivial. Finally, let me flag that when using a pronoun to refer to a generic agent, and when using pronouns in illustrations featuring a specific fictitious agent, I use one of she, he, or the non-binary singular they. That is, the they that refers to a non-binary person, rather than the unwieldy she, he, or they. Recognizing, of course, that none of these terms figures as the personal, sometimes referred to as preferred, pronoun of all agents, or as a generally accepted gender-neutral singular pronoun. Note that, given my limited knowledge concerning the variety of practical and theoretical complications regarding distributing the different pronouns, I certainly do not mean to suggest that the distribution in this manuscript follows some approach that is free of pitfalls, or that there is no better way of departing from certain familiar approaches wherein non-binary persons do not appear at all. It is perhaps worth mentioning that the distribution is not indicative of current estimates regarding the proportion of individuals who identify as non-binary, which appears to be relatively small. It is, however, in a way, more consonant with such estimates than certain alternative distributions that might be considered, such as, for example, a distribution involving a default that minimizes current use of the historically overrepresented he in favor of, say, alternating, whenever practicable, between she and the non-binary singular they. The greater consonance may be for better or for worse, depending on a proper assessment of the relative advantages and pitfalls of different approaches. As with other aspects of the book, I welcome as many thoughtful comments as I am lucky to receive. Introduction. Choosing well can be quite the challenge, and in many cases, seemingly modest claims paper over philosophically interesting complications. Consider, for instance, the idea that one should not sweat the small stuff, or, more formally, that one should treat trivial effects as trivial. This seems like solid, or at worst superfluous, advice, but when you think about it, not sweating the small stuff can be a recipe for disaster. Why? Because big stuff is made of small stuff, and presumably we should sweat the big stuff, which suggests that we really should sweat the small stuff after all. Consider some examples familiar from everyday life on the many ways in which we often voluntarily inch toward terrible results. We eat too much, save too little, and wreak havoc on the environment. But in many cases, each step toward unhealthy weight gain, destitution, and environmental destruction seems trivial in terms of making things worse than they are. Perhaps, paradoxically, it does not make sense to consistently treat trivial effects as trivial. One thing that is clear is that choosing well and theorizing about choosing well can be quite tricky. To put the point more positively, getting a handle on what choosing well involves can be of great philosophical and practical import. This book focuses on the challenges associated with effective choice over time. Its contributions are meant to be of both theoretical and practical interest, and indeed to illustrate the power of theoretical models in illuminating debate about practical problems. I focus, in particular, on the challenges raised by cyclic preferences and by preference gaps. One's preferences with respect to a set of options count as cyclic when one cannot rank the options from most preferred to least preferred because one's preferences form a loop, as for example in Figure 1.1, which can be found in the print and ebook versions of this book. To take an all-too-familiar case of cyclic preferences, an agent may prefer, on each day, open brackets, D sub 0, D sub 1, D sub 2, and so on up to D sub 1000, close brackets, to put off dieting for just one more day, but also prefers starting to diet at D sub 0 over starting to diet at D sub 1000. Preference gaps also preclude the agent neatly ordering the available options from most preferred to least preferred, even allowing for ties, since, insofar as a set of preferences include gaps, not every option is ranked in relation to every other option, not even as exactly equally favored. An agent might, for example, find themselves unable to rank pursuing a particular artistic activity and pursuing a particular athletic activity because they see the options as neither one better than the other nor exactly equally good. Although cyclic preferences and preference gaps often arise quite naturally, they make the agent susceptible to self-defeating patterns of choice, in which the agent is drawn into taking each of a series of steps that, collectively, lead the agent to a result that they deem unacceptable. Consider, for example, that in the diet case, the agent might end up binging for 1,000 days in a row, after repeatedly deciding to put off dieting for one more day. In the artistic versus athletic activities case, the agent might, given the choice between the two activities, start pursuing one option, but then waver and incur a small cost to switch to pursuing the other option, which was available to the agent before without the extra cost. My guiding questions in this book are the following. What is an agent to do if she finds herself with cyclic preferences or with preference gaps? Is an agent with such preferences necessarily irrational? In my view, the answer to the latter question is no. Rationality does not invariably prohibit disorderly preferences, but it does, to get back to the first question, prompt us to proceed with caution and with a readiness to show restraint, based on an awareness of larger dynamics when our preferences are disorderly. Theories of rational choice often dismiss or abstract away from the sorts of disorderly preferences that I focus on. They assume that rational agents can and should have neat preferences over their options. But this assumption is problematic. As I will explain, rationality can validate certain disorderly preference structures while also protecting us from self-defeating patterns of choice. Ultimately, my reasoning regarding cyclic preferences and preference gaps leads me to a revisionary way of understanding instrumental rationality. In particular, my reasoning supports the conclusion that the subjective appraisal responses to which instrumental rationality is accountable go beyond the appraisal responses captured by an agent's preferences, which are the only subjective appraisal responses recognized by standard conceptions of instrumental rationality. They also include what I call categorical subjective appraisal responses. Recognition of these additional responses is important for properly understanding the major pitfall associated with disorderly preferences, and for seeing how it can be averted. The book is organized as follows. In Chapter 1, I focus first on the requirement in rational choice theory that an agent's preferences be acyclic, that is, non-cyclic. It is commonly acknowledged that preferences can include preference cycles, or loops. Relatedly, the requirements of rational choice theory are not normally understood as describing or defining preferences, but instead as either rational requirements on preferences or else as conditions that preferences must satisfy for rationality to be able to provide an agent with guidance. The requirement of acyclicity is often defended as a requirement of rationality based on the money pump argument, which suggests that an agent with cyclic preferences is susceptible to self-defeating patterns of choice, wherein following her preferences leads her to incur a sure loss. More specifically, the argument suggests that an agent with cyclic preferences is susceptible to serving as a money pump, wherein the agent repeatedly incurs a small cost to upgrade relative to her preferences, and, because her preferences are cyclic, ends up with the same option she began with, but with less money. After reviewing the money pump argument, I consider a defense of the possibility of rationally cyclic preferences. In particular, I focus on cases in which cyclic preferences seem perfectly appropriate, and on reasons for thinking that cyclic preferences can be generated by defensible ways of comparing alternatives. I also revisit the money pump argument and suggest that there is room for reinterpreting it, so that it figures not as an argument against the rational permissibility of cyclic preferences, but instead as an argument against the idea that a rational agent is invariably guided by her preferences. Preferences will, I assume, often be revealed in choice. But this is not inevitably the case, since there are complications involving, for instance, habits, non-deliberative follow-through on prior plans, and/or the recognition of a conflict between acting on some of one's preferences and doing justice to one's categorical subjective appraisal responses, as discussed in Chapter 3, that can prompt an agent to act contrary to her preferences. Next, I focus on the requirement in rational choice theory that an agent's preferences be complete. According to the requirement of completeness, an agent's preferences must be such that for all options X and Y, the agent prefers X to Y, or prefers Y to X, or is indifferent between X and Y. This precludes preference gaps wherein two options are not ranked by the agent's preferences, not even as exactly equally favored. As with cyclic preferences, incomplete preferences, although they can raise challenges for the agent, sometimes arise quite naturally. I consider a defense of the rational permissibility of incomplete preferences in terms of the possibility of incommensurable alternatives, understood as alternatives that are neither one better than the other, at least not determinately so, nor exactly equally good. The possibility of incommensurable alternatives helps make sense of incomplete preferences, even apart from the fact that having preferences over all possible options seems beyond our capacities as agents with limited mental resources. Where two options are neither one better than the other, nor exactly equally good, a preference gap between them seems perfectly appropriate. The possibility of incommensurable alternatives is generally supported via an appeal to cases that fit the small improvement argument. According to this argument, there are cases in which A is not better than B, B is not better than A, and A plus, a slightly improved version of A, is better than A, but not better than B, given the plausible assumption that if two options are exactly equally good, then a further option that is better than one of the options will be better than the other option as well, an assumption that is not impacted by my reasoning about rationally cyclic preferences if, as I argue in Chapter 6, better than can and should be understood as acyclic even if is rationally preferred to is not. It follows that, in addition to not being one better than the other, A and B are not exactly equally good either. In light of what I see as a particularly compelling small improvement scenario, I am led, as in the first part of Chapter 1, to the idea that rationality sometimes requires not that our preferences be neat and orderly, but instead that we proceed with caution and with an awareness of larger dynamics when our preferences are disorderly. In Chapter 2, I argue that the sort of self-defeating patterns of choice that agents with cyclic and incomplete preferences must guard against is particularly interesting because it cannot be explained in terms of the self-losing control over behavior. Rather, things go badly even though the self remains at the helm and is informed about the consequences of each option. It might seem as though informed behavior cannot be both self-defeating and self-governed. Consider the following line of reasoning, which I have set apart and slightly indented so that its scope is clear, an arrangement that will occur repeatedly without further flagging. If one's behavior is self-governed, it is governed by values and commitments with which one identifies and which one does not find alien. And so one's behavior is true to oneself, assuming it is based on an awareness of the consequences of each choice one makes. Behavior that is true to oneself does not also defeat the same self, and so self-governed behavior is not self-defeating. We are thus left with a dilemma that seems to undermine the possibility of informed self-defeating behavior. On the one hand, given that self-defeat involves being defeated by oneself, if some behavior is not self-governed, it cannot be self-defeating. On the other hand, given that self-governance involves being true to oneself, if some behavior is self-governed, it cannot, assuming it is informed, be self-defeating. So it seems that if informed, neither self-governed behavior nor behavior that is not self-governed can be self-defeating. One response to this dilemma is to grant that self-defeating behavior, understood as behavior involving the defeat of one's self by oneself, where the self in question is defined, roughly speaking, in terms of one's commitments and values, is indeed impossible, but to stress that in a looser sense, wherein self-defeat involves the defeat of one's self by desires and behaviors that one disowns despite recognizing them as in some sense one's own, self-defeating behavior is possible. In this weaker sense, the classic case of the unwilling addict, who persistently disowns her desire for drugs even as she persistently seeks out drugs, is a case of self-defeating behavior. My focus, however, is on vindicating the possibility of behavior that is self-defeating in a stronger sense, a sense in which the desires and behaviors that are defeating one's self are ones with which one identifies. I thus move away from the classic case of the unwilling addict and consider two other types of cases in which it is tempting to say that the agent's behavior is self-defeating. The first case, which involves preference reversals, gets us closer than the classic case of the unwilling addict to a case of strictly self-defeating behavior. The second case, which involves cyclic preferences, arguably gets us all the way there. After considering the second case, I turn to interesting complications raised by cases involving incommensurable alternatives. I conclude by explaining the implications of the possibility of self-defeating self-governance for instrumental rationality. In Chapter 3, I first raise and solve a puzzle about the emerging conception of instrumental rationality, according to which instrumental rationality allows for certain forms of disorderliness, but requires that one proceed with caution and sometimes show restraint so as to avoid ending up realizing a self-defeating pattern of choice. In a nutshell, the puzzle can be described as follows. If showing restraint, from the point of view of instrumental rationality, is a matter of settling on a dispreferred option, and realizing a self-defeating pattern of choice is a matter of realizing a dispreferred option, then showing restraint so as to avoid ending up realizing a self-defeating pattern of choice amounts to settling on a dispreferred option so as to avoid realizing a dispreferred option, which doesn't make sense. I solve this puzzle by distinguishing between relational subjective appraisal responses and categorical subjective appraisal responses, and interpreting these responses as figuring in human psychology as two distinct kinds of responses. Relational subjective appraisal responses rank options in relation to one another. It is these appraisal responses that are captured by the agent's preferences. Note that I'll be loosely describing the favoring of one option in a pair as the ranking of that option over the other, even when no ranking of all the options is to be had because the agent's preferences are cyclic. If my use of ranking seems too loose, it can be eliminated by the listener via appropriate substitutions. By contrast, categorical subjective appraisal responses place options in categories, such as, for example, great or terrible. While instrumental rationality is standardly understood as accountable to only relational subjective appraisal responses, I argue that it is also accountable to categorical subjective appraisal responses. If this is right, then we can make sense of the idea that, in cases involving rationally cyclic preferences, instrumental rationality sometimes calls for showing restraint so as to avoid ending up realizing a self-defeating pattern of choice. For when preferences are rationally cyclic, we can interpret showing restraint as settling on a dispreferred option, and interpret the demand that one avoid realizing a self-defeating pattern of choice as requiring, perhaps among other things, not that one avoid realizing a dispreferred option, since that is not possible, but that one avoid ending up in an unnecessarily low appraisal category, such as ending up with a terrible option when great options are available. In the last section of Chapter 3, I raise and solve a similar puzzle regarding the money pump argument. The puzzle is as follows. According to a prominent interpretation of the money pump argument, the argument is supposed to show that cyclic preferences are irrational by showing that following one's cyclic preferences can lead one to a dispreferred alternative. But then the argument is grounded in the assumption that it is irrational to make choices that lead one to a dispreferred alternative. And as I explain, this assumption arguably begs the question against someone who thinks rational preference cycles are possible. The assumption that it is irrational to make choices that lead one to a dispreferred alternative is also problematic in relation to the reinterpretation of the money pump argument presented in Chapter 1, which allows for rationally cyclic preferences and casts the threat of being money pumped as undermining the idea that a rational agent will invariably act on her preferences. For if one allows for rationally cyclic preferences, then one must grant that even a rational agent can be in a position where she must settle on a dispreferred alternative. But then it cannot be assumed that it is irrational to make choices that lead one to a dispreferred alternative. The solution is to see the money pump argument as relying on an assumption that is common ground between opponents and defenders of rationally cyclic preferences, namely, the assumption that rationality requires one to avoid any alternative A- that is exactly the same as some other available alternative A, except for one disadvantageous difference. Interpreted in this way, the argument is reestablished as forcefully suggesting that either rational preferences cannot be cyclic, or rational agents do not invariably follow their preferences. In Chapter 4, I return to the distinction between relational and categorical appraisal responses, and use it to illuminate the possibility of incommensurable alternatives and incomplete preferences. In particular, I show that, insofar as we have both categorical appraisal responses and relational appraisal responses, we should expect there to be many cases of parity in which the options are in the same league or in the same neighborhood, but not comparable as one better than the other or as exactly equally good, relative to what matters in the case at hand. To begin with, I consider cases in which all that matters in the case at hand is the current appeal to the agent of each option. In such cases, all that is relevant is the agent's subjective appraisal responses. But relational subjective appraisal responses on the part of an agent will often be limited to cases in which the options are quite similar to one another, as with A and A+, where A+ is a slightly improved version of A, or else different enough to elicit different categorical responses. In cases where the agent has the same categorical subjective appraisal response to two options that are quite different from one another, that is, both options are excellent, the agent may find herself with no relational subjective appraisal response at all. Her preferences will thus be incomplete, and not because she is missing some pertinent information, since by hypothesis the matter is purely subjective. After considering some objections to my position, I show how it can be built on to eliminate cases of parity, even when what matters is not purely subjective. Significantly, my appeal to categorical appraisal responses can help explain how two options that are neither one better than the other nor exactly equally good can be on a par in terms of their overall value relative to what matters in the case at hand without being roughly equally good. My response picks up on the idea that the grading system used to evaluate certain sets of options may have to employ broadly applicable evaluative terms. The result is broad evaluative classes, or leagues, or neighborhoods, for which it is not safe to assume that all of the options that are in the same evaluative class are close enough in value to count as roughly equally good. Indeed, for some pairs of options in the same class, it can be clear that one of the options is more than a little better than the other. Still, because in accordance with the setup of the scenario provided, no more refined grading system is applicable, two options in the same evaluative class, or league, or neighborhood, that are neither one better than the other, nor exactly equally good, are plausibly counted as on a par. In Chapter 5, I turn to the question of whether incommensurable options can invariably be understood as being on a par, or whether some incommensurable options are strictly incomparable. The small improvement argument is sometimes put forward as an argument for incomparability. But Even if there are genuine small improvement cases in which A is not better than B, B is not better than A, and yet A and B do not qualify as exactly equally good because A+, which is a slightly improved version.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?